Musicology Forum. And this is a series of lectures we give from the Musicology department, and thank you to Bruce Brown for chairing the Musicology department. This is also sponsored by the USC Huntington Early Modern Studies Institute. And EMSI has given us generous funding for our concerts and lectures since 2006. And so feel free to let EMSI know that you're enjoying what they're doing. You've got your link from them, I believe. And also, this is being co-presented in collaboration with Early Music America. And if you are not a member of Early Music America, please do consider joining. At some point, Rochelle will pop in their little link for joining Early Music America, which has been doing amazing things for people during this pandemic year. They've been raising funds for needy musicians. They've been presenting things for how to do things on the pandemic, all kinds of stuff. So, on to the lecture. I would like to introduce you to Sarah Mead. Sarah Mead is Professor of Practice of Music at Brandeis University, where she leads the Early Music Ensemble, and she teaches courses in historical performance practice, and also she teaches viola da gamba. She's a sought-after teacher of viola da gamba and Renaissance and Baroque ensembles on the local, national, and international level. She's the director and founding member of Nota Bene Viol Consort, and she's recognized as a performer of the lyra-viol. She's known for her writings and presentations on applied theory of the 16th century, and I have to tell you, her writings assigned every semester on the musical hand and etc., music theory, in our classes. So people here know Sarah Mead. And I will say that also, before I give the name of this talk, I've been dying to have Sarah talk about this because she gave this talk to me one night over a couple of beers after class at a workshop, and I still have the piece of paper with all the marks. So I figured it's time for me to get a second run out of it and everybody else to see it. And this is her talk today is called Navigational Instruments, Charting Early Modern Musical Geography. And please, as I mute you, please jazz hands and welcome Sarah Mead.
Hi, everybody. I'm glad you're here. And you'll let us know if you can't hear me properly, I'm sure.
Yep. You have to unmute you. So there you go.
Yeah, there we go. I gave the talk the title of Navigational Instruments because of the way that our instruments help us to navigate early music. For most of us, the first map to the musical universe that we were provided with as children was probably the keyboard. And that map showed us a vast horizontal stretch of notes, repeating their 8-note patterns of 2 black keys, 3 black keys in both directions, from the lower end to the left to the higher end to the right, onwards ad infinitum. I think I'll just have to show you a picture to remember just how that looks to all of us. I'll do a little sharing of the screen here. So that's that keyboard I'm talking about. And that keyboard was what we learned our scales and arpeggios on by following that map. And later we were told we could think of the modes by just imagining the white notes on the keyboard. This is the way it came to me in my mind, that this was a continuous thing that went on forever in just 2 directions, up and down. When I first encountered Guido's hand, however, as a student of early music, it didn't look like any map of the musical world that we'd ever seen before. And I think all of us who first encountered it tried to wrench it into line with what we already knew. It doesn't look like a keyboard at all, but until we could throw away the maps we thought were the only way to conceive of pitches, we couldn't make use of this new way of navigating. I know that when I first encountered this particular map to music, I thought it was intellectually interesting, but I didn't think it was really applicable. And it was a long time before I actually spent time navigating my musical world by using this particular map. I'm going to show you how differently that kind of navigation looks from what we're used to. So here's our hand. And instead of a keyboard that goes from one side to the other, we start here and we trace downwards, across, up and around, and in and across, and finally jump off the top of the hand entirely. And that map is a very different one from the kind that we're used to following for music, going left and right. This spiral is inward going. Going up is going in. Very different feeling. We're accustomed to maps that put everything on an equal footing. Maps that we use to get around in the world. They provide us with data rather than stories. I'll give you an example. Here is, I'm just going to navigate for a second. Yes, here is a map of Europe that's easy to get on the web. It looks not unlike a little bit more colorful than a Google map, but what we have is a series of places. Here it is, as conceived, the same exact part of the world as conceived in a 16th century map. This map, to me, feels much more personal, and we're drawn into a narrative as we explore it. We see not only the kind of people who might be found in these various places, but maps to some of the individual cities. We have a feeling for distance as we look out across the waters, and of course we have these wonderful boats and even mythical creatures to look at. We have lions in Africa. This feels much more personal. To gain a better idea of the musical worldview of the 16th century, it's worth considering the way its geography was conceived. It's hard to throw out the high-tech navigational tools we're used to. We've gained them from years of tonal music theory. But when we use them, we may not be experiencing the same journey that an early modern person experienced when making music. A number of historical tools can help us to view the landscape through different eyes. Surviving instruments and iconography serve as the basis for modeling new instruments on old principles, like these ones you can see behind me. In addition, the flourishing of at-home music making in 16th century Europe was fed by an outpouring of how-to books that capture in words and charts the way that instruments reflected the world of vocal music they were designed to emulate. A number of authors took on the problem of explaining the geography of the recorder in words and charts. I'm going to show you some pictures of some of the ways that that was done in the 16th century. Once again, I'll just do a little share for you. Here we have a few pictures that give us a variety of the solutions that people seeking to write down how to conceive of the recorder for people who weren't going to be present in the same room with them were thought about. The first one is from 1511, and you can see that, well, I don't know if you can see, it takes a little figuring out, but what you have here is you have lines and spaces from a musical staff, but they're being used in different ways for each instrument. The bassus here, we can look at this part of the chart and see that the bass recorder is considered to be based from gamma ut, down here below the F clef, and going up to the D above middle C. Here we have a tenor recorder starting at the C below the bass clef and going up to the B above the G clef. And you can see the same thing here with a descant recorder starting on a low G below the C clef. These numbers here are showing you what holes need to be uncovered in order to make these notes. The same kind of uncovering system is described here in Agricola's Musica Instrumentalis Deutsch from 1532. And in this, once again, you see all fingers down and then holes being slowly opened up, the names of the notes, and also the names of the solmization syllables that those notes would be called by as you went up the instrument. The charts then thus include staff lines and clefs and syllables, all of them together. Now, Sylvestro Ganassi, just a little bit after this book of Agricola, devised a less cerebral system for teaching. He used drawings of the instrument with holes closed. If they're darkened in, they're closed holes. And this one on the side here is the thumb hole, because you can't see behind the recorder. It's sticking out to the side. Or open holes, which are seen here. The see-through holes are the open ones. And you can see that this chart is right beside a description, a word description, which he felt was necessary to explain all that was going on here. The advantage of this system, which is not unlike what we see even nowadays with flute or recorder fingering charts, is it allows the student to imagine what it feels like to make each note. The syllables associated with each note, which you see running up the right-hand side here, help the player to associate directly the position of the fingers with the function of the note within the gamut. Now, I've combined Ganassi's fingerings with a sort of a modern fingering chart so you can see them more clearly. So here's Ganassi's original chart, and here I've transcribed it down here, and with the corresponding notes on C, F, and G recorders. Those of you who are paying really close attention will notice that there are a few of these notes for the G recorder which I've put in brackets because they don't correspond with the solmization syllable here. On the C and F recorders, they correspond all the way. You'll also notice here, so here is ut, all holes covered. And there it is, all holes covered, and that could be C ut, F ut, or G ut. Here's re with one hole open, and there it is on the modern chart. If you read through the syllables, ut, re, mi, fa, sol, re, mi, fa, sol, la, you'll see that he is mutating from one hexachord to the next on the way up, the same way you would if you were singing. Now, we have a couple of notes written in here that aren't included in his chart. And you can see they don't have a syllable associated with them. And that's because he only gives fingerings for notes that are within the Guidonian hand. Anything that is extra manum, he leaves up to us to figure out how to play. These fingerings that are given for those notes outside the hand are derived logically from what has to happen to get the notes that are inside the gamut. And these are the fingerings that have been given by modern builders of Ganassi-style recorders to show you how to achieve those extra notes. You'll note that the extra notes, the ones you would have to figure out for yourself, all involve skipping some hole, some kind of forked fingering. And those fingerings are much less direct than to blow than the fingerings which you see here at the beginning of the chart, which don't skip any holes. Those forked fingerings are going to give you a sense of more resistance from the instrument. It will be slightly softer, a little stuffier, and also will be prone to your own judgment in figuring out how best to figure it to bring them into tune. You'll also see that the notes called fa, right here, that's also a forked fingering, which is an interesting thing to keep in mind. The fa being a forked fingering is going to be slightly softer, slightly less direct and focused than the other notes that are depicted here. And I think the wind players can consider how that makes them actually feel physically as they play the fa before or after the adjacent mi. Now, Ganassi introduced a similar approach in his book for viol players called Regula Rubertina. I'm going to show you the chart that he made for the fingerboard of the viola da gamba. Here we go. It's a little unexpected, isn't it? It doesn't show you any frets, it just shows you the names of the strings. And mostly what he has to say in this chart is how to conceive of the relationships between the 6 strings and how to tune each one to the one above it. On each string, in the writing here, he gives the name of this is the letter name of the note, or littera, and these are the syllables, or voces, of that written note. So this is, he says, D, sol, re, gamma, sol, re, ut, si, fa, sol, fa, ut. But what's more interesting than that is that after that he writes what interval is between that string and the next one up. And he characterizes the interval not just by calling it a diatessaron of 4th, but what kind of diatessaron it is. It's the re sol species, the first of the species of 4th. Whereas here we have the ut fa species, the third of the species of 4th. Now, I don't know about you, but that's the kind of thing that I would tend to zone out on when I first saw it. I would say, yeah, okay, I can see what the strings are named, and then there's a bunch of Latin. Now I'll play. But in fact, there's a great deal of information there that is worth paying attention to. I wonder, it might be time to review the concept of species of intervals, because you also may have begun to zone out as I mentioned it. And maybe I'll start just by showing you a brief picture of the way that the gamut is built. So this is how the 7 hexachords are work in conjunction with each other in order to build the entire gamut. We have the natural hexachord here, ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, and its upper half, fa, sol, la, could, because it is the same intervals as the intervals between ut, re, and mi, can also be called ut, re, and mi as the beginning of the natural hexachord that takes off from F and goes upward from it. The hard hexachord is here shown below the natural hexachord, showing where the equivalents of fa, sol, la with the natural ut, re, mi take place and how those notes move down from it. Presumably this is known by most of you, but this is a little quick review. I will also just zip down to the end to show you the complete range of the notes of the gamut, from the lowest of the hexachords starting on the low G called gamma ut and going up to the highest of the hard hexachords that ends on E. Now, with that in mind, we can talk briefly about how the species of intervals work. Because if we know that there are 6 notes that make up the voces musicales, what we nowadays call the hexachord, we know that the most special thing about those 6 notes is the half step between mi and fa. So, if I were to talk about what a fifth is, I could show you my fingers, because fortunately I happen to have 5 of them. So from here to here we could call a fifth. Now if I have all my fingers apart, I'm implying a series of whole steps, and we wouldn't get a fifth, we would get an augmented fifth. Somewhere in there we need to have a half step in order to have a pure fifth. The half step could go there, or there, or there, or there. So there are 4 places that the half step could go. Each of those places creates a different shape of the fifth. So the fifth that goes from here to here, although it would sound like the same interval, would feel differently because of how it's broken up within it. And we can feel that difference largely because of where we associate the half step with its syllables. If this is mi, fa, sol, re, mi, makes the mi, fifth. Here, mi, fa comes second. That would make this re, and that makes this fifth re, la. Here, when it comes third, we've got mi, fa happening here, gives us ut, re, mi, fa, sol. And finally, if we put it here, mi, fa is at the end, and we get fa, sol, re, mi, fa. Now each of those is going to, if we just sing the outermost notes without thinking about what comes between them, we won't be able to tell that they're 4 different fifths. But as soon as we play those on an instrument, the position of our hand on the viol or on the recorder will tell us what fifth we're playing. And that's exactly what we're seeing in these pictures of the intervals. Now, Ganassi showed us a fourth, so let's just review that as well. There are 3 places the half step can go in a fourth, so there are 3 species of fourth. And he describes the distance between the G and the C string as being the first species of fourth, which is from re to sol, which would look like that. As I said before, like so many others who study and play early music, I was aware that there was a lot of writing about these things, but I tended to brush it off as theoretical. It was really only when I began to play the alto viol that the light dawned, and this is the story that got me and Adam talking late one night at a workshop on the West Coast. I had played bass and tenor and treble viol for a long time, and I was fairly accustomed to reading from old notation. And I acquired an alto viol tuned 1 step higher than a tenor, and was doing some evening sight reading at a workshop with some people who like to read from early notation. And I encountered a clef I don't normally spend much time in, and I was playing an instrument I'd never played before, and I was a little bit panicky that I would fall apart, and yet I kept playing the right notes, and I couldn't figure out why. I was a little bit afraid of looking down and falling off the tightrope, but I began to suddenly realize why I could play this instrument, even though it was tuned differently from any other instrument I'd played before. And it was because I wasn't thinking about the literae, the letter notes, the letter names of the notes. I was thinking about the voces, the syllables of the notes. And I realized all of a sudden that the 3rd string of every viol I played functioned as mi. that if we think it through, on the alto viol, the third string is B. And a B string seemed anathema to me. I couldn't imagine any instrument having a B string, and yet it seemed to be playing fine. It's when I realized that B functions as mi. It's the only thing you can ever call B. It's always mi. And my brain quickly went to the other instruments I play, and I realized that the third string on a bass or a treble is E. That's me. And the third string on an alto viol is A. That's me. And all of a sudden, it fell together. It might help for those of you who don't play the viol to see a picture of the fingerboard to picture this. And so I will provide that. Here we have a very nice picture of the top of a viol fingerboard that was provided to me by the builder Francis Beaulieu, who actually built my alto viol. And one of the things I love about it is that he actually put thick wound strings at the bottom and thin strings at the top, so you know where the bass side is. There are the 6 strings. And here are the names, the letter names of those 6 strings on a bass or treble viol. And here they are with the tenor viol, and finally with the alto viol. Now we can see all the strings together. I'd like you to take a look at those for a moment and think back to what you know about the voces musicales and see if you see anything in common amongst them. I already pointed out that these three here are all function as the syllable mi. The B functions as mi in the hard hexachord, the A functions as mi in the soft hexachord, and the E functions as mi in the natural hexachord. So what do the other notes represent? If the third string is mi, that suggests that the fourth string is ut. And let's look at what those notes are. C, F, and G. Does that remind you of anything? We'll move on. The C, the F, and the G are the beginning notes of the 3 hexachords, and they're also the standard lowest notes of recorders. So the relationship of the instruments one to another is the same amongst viols and amongst recorders. And depending on other instruments you're playing, you're going to find others that have very similar relationships as well. It's for this reason that I have come to think of the bass and the treble of the viola da gamba family not as instruments which are often nowadays referred to as in D, because the top and bottom strings are D, but as instruments in C, because everything is relating to that C ut. And tenor instruments as being in F, and alto instruments as being in G, very much in the same way that we think of recorders. And in fact, in the 16th century, the F and G instruments were often both called tenors or both called altos. And the bass and treble instruments, which are both, in my book, in C, are really an octave apart, the same way that a treble and a tenor recorder are. Whereas there was also a large bass viol that was an octave below the alto, which would have been in G, just like a large bass recorder would be. Okay, that was the beginning of my revelation. Once you begin to think of the strings of the viol or the lute as voces within the gamut, rather than simply as their literae, their letter names, then the geography becomes apparent. And at that point, the relationship between the families of viols, lutes, and recorders fall into place, as well as the clefs and the names most often associated with the different sizes. There's a kinesthetic feeling of playing the voces with their different functions within the gamut that gives much of the character to the music and helps to drive our understanding of the overlapping nature of the hexachords and the appropriate use of transposition. For example, if you were playing a piece where ut was C, using the natural hexachord, you could easily transpose it to where ut is F and play the same thing on a different size of instrument with exactly the same fingerings. If you were to transpose it by a third rather than a fourth or a fifth, then you would be losing all of those relationships of half steps and whole steps that are normal, and you would find yourself in a strange place tuning-wise, but also in a strange place as far as your fingers are concerned and how it feels to play an ut or a re or a sol that have different feelings under your hand. I'll see if I can show you a little bit more about this. We're going to look now at how the frets work on the viola da gamba. And for those of you who play, this will be familiar, but maybe a way you haven't thought about them before. So just to get us started, for those who aren't aware of it, there are 7 frets on the viola da gamba. This is the open string where the string crosses the nut, and that is the pitch of each string when it's open. Those are the notes that we talked about at first. Each successive fret is a semitone above the last one, and there are 7 of them. These are the pitches of the open strings on a bass or treble viol. Here are the pitches on the first fret, second fret, third, etc. Now what you'll notice is that at the open string and at the 5th and the 7th frets, the notes are all within the Guidonian hand. But on the other frets, we have a lot of sharps and flats. And since B flat is the only accidental which is included in the Guidonian hand, we have a lot of notes here that have to be conceived of a little bit differently and are more difficult to tune. The distance from the open string to the 5th fret is a 4th, and from the open string to the 7th fret is a 5th. And it makes sense then that these are the pitches of the strings of a tenor viol, which is a 4th higher than a bass, and these are the open string pitches of an alto viol, which is a 5th higher than a bass. Now let's look at the strings that aren't on those perfect intervals. We have, the frets. What we have here, I've circled in green. Do you remember that green was the color I used for the soft hexachord? I'll just put that in the back of your mind. I've circled in green all the notes that are flats or considered fa within the Guidonian hand. And since every flatted note is considered a fa, these notes all function as fa when they're in a melodic shape or in a harmonic shape. The ones I've put in the red box, and you may recall that the hard hexachord I had colored red, are all the ones that would be considered mi in their context, either mi within the hand or mi's from outside the hand. They all function as the lower semitone of 2 semitones, the mi-fa semitone. You'll see that one of these frets has nothing but mi's on it. This fret has mi or a note which is already within the normal span of the hexachord. This fret has a mixture. and so does this, which leaves you wondering how you're going to tune those frets. This is one of the solutions that people have come up with in order to make them work. Because of course for a fa, you're going to want your note to be a little higher than if it were a mi. So some people split their first fret in half so that the upper half of it plays fas and the lower half can play mi. Another option is to make this flat slanted, this fret slanted so that it's higher on the fa side and lower on the mi side. Since all of the notes here function as mi, this fret can be just slightly lower. All of them function here as fa, it can be slightly higher. Same with the mi here, and this fret we often see split as well because of the two functions they could have, or you see it at an angle. Okay. So, thank goodness our frets move, right? Otherwise, we could never get that special relationship between mi and fa, which is based on the idea that that semitone is a little bit larger than other semitones. So a semitone which is between two notes which have different letter names is always slightly larger than the semitone between two notes that have the same letter name. When we think about the significance of the mi-fa semitone, it underscores the significance in the feel of the four principal modes as we play them. Here is what our hands have to do. I'm going to show you, actually, before I get to what our hands have to do to make those modes play, I'm just going to show you sorry, back up here. A reminder for those who may have not be familiar with the species of intervals associated with each of the principal modes. Here's a chart. Here we have the Dorian Fifth, which is Re La, and the Dorian Fourth, which is Re Sol. Together, those can make up the ambitus of a Hypodorian or a Dorian mode piece. Your hand is going to spend a lot of time playing notes with those that are in that set, and particularly the ones that are at the bottom and the top of that set. And partly how we recognize the mode of a piece is from feeling our hands go to those particular places where the important notes of the mode take place. The Phrygian Fifth has the mi-fa at the bottom. That's going to feel very different under the hand. And the mi-fa is at the bottom of the Phrygian Fourth as well. Now, I have given you the true theoretical Lydian Fifth, but also the one that actually takes place in most pieces of music, because most Lydian pieces of music have a B flat in them. And this is the Lydian Fourth. And finally, the Mixolydian Fifth and the Mixolydian Fourth. The Mixolydian Fourth is the same as the Dorian Fourth, because there are only 3 species of fourths, so one of them has to do double duty. With those in mind, you don't have to memorize them, there's no test, but what you're seeing is that your fingers are following a different pattern of whole steps and half steps with each of these patterns of fifths and fourths that make up the modes. And now I'll show them to you on the strings of a viol, where they look like this. There's Dorian. In Dorian, you've got 3 strings which, as open strings, actually vibrate within the Dorian mode. D's and A's, the most important notes of the Dorian mode, are vibrating all the time that those strings are open. Other notes that are being held by that hand in the bass and the treble are on the 1st and the 5th frets, the 2nd and the 5th frets, which are ones that are quite stable. Now, on the tenor, you'll see that there are still 2 resonating strings in the mode, and that the notes that are principal in that mode are only involve 1 fret, which is a little bit less stable and has some tuning issues. On the alto, you've got 3 notes that are vibrating very happily within the mode, and your fingers are on very strong frets. Let's go to the Phrygian mode. You'll notice I changed color just as I did on that chart of the modes. I'll tell you about that in a second. To start with, the Phrygian mode on the bass has only 1 string that's vibrating in that mode, and it doesn't use the strongest 5th fret. No open strings vibrate in the Phrygian mode on the tenor. But then again, the alto is as though born to play Phrygian. This is going to influence how a piece is going to sound on your consort, depending on what instruments you choose to use it on. Lydian mode. Lydian mode works very well on the bass, although that low F is not always terribly strong. But we do have the use of a fret here, which is quite difficult to get perfectly in tune. And for the first time, we're reaching back for the 1st fret, putting a space of a whole step between the 1st and the 2nd finger, which makes it quite a different feeling, a little bit reminiscent of forked fingerings on recorders. Here's Lydian on the tenor. Tenor was born to play Lydian music. It loves it. It sounds fabulous in it. Here's Lydian on the alto. It's dreadful. Try to avoid it at all costs. You may, if you're a recorder player, think about which of your alto recorders you're going to pick up for a given piece. Are you going to play the F alto or the G alto? And that will be influenced by the mode of the piece as well. And here's Mixolydian. Every viol loves the Mixolydian. Just see how on fire with G the viols all are. Already you can see just by looking at the colors in each of those that the viols are going to light up in different ways depending on the mode that you're playing in. Just as if you sneeze in my studio here and you sneeze on a D or an A, these instruments will just ring like crazy. But if you sneeze a B, there's nothing coming out of the instruments. They're silent. The vibrations that come from within these instruments are very striking. And the fact that you were going to hear that tells you something about how music in different modes is going to sound on these instruments. Now, I told you I'd get back to why did I use those colors on that slide. And also on the slide of the 4 different sets of the modal species of the 5ths and 4ths. And that is because part of using these different maps to get into the instruments of another time is understanding that the 16th century European mind was in tune with what we would now call synesthesia. The idea of connecting one of our senses to another or even more of our senses. And we see lots of descriptions and artistic renditions which show us of the ways that the Renaissance mind connected different aspects of the world into the same kinds of patterns. An example for that would be the 4 humors, of which many of you have heard, each of which was associated with a color and one of the cardinal directions and a planet and a type of weather, whether it be cool or dry or moist or warm. All of those things, all of those contrasting 4s of things were related to each other in the Renaissance mind and in a number of different artistic ways. And the colors that I associate with the 4 principal modes are the ones that are associated with the 4 principal humors. Keeping those colors in my mind as I draw these charts helps to remind me to feel differently about each of the modes as I play in it. Now, why does that matter? Well, another one of those things that we learned in school, but we sort of ignored because it didn't make sense in our modern maps of music, was the idea that the modes had personalities, had emotions associated with them. After all, in our big keyboard world, we just think in terms of major and minor modes for the most part, and that those can be transposed to any key and will be equivalent. But the Renaissance modes, being based on these very different small germs of the fifth and the fourth, which are characteristic of each mode, actually feel differently the same way that those fifths that I talked about feel differently when you imply all the notes within them. Now, because theorists sometimes gave different opinions about how the modes made you feel, it's been easy for modern day musicologists to say, see, it didn't really mean anything anyway, they can't even agree on it. But in fact, what's really important is that they thought there was a feeling associated with a mode, not so much what the feeling was, but that it was natural to conceive of there being a feeling associated with the mode. And as you play modal music, you begin to realize that these feelings do cook down into general characteristics that fit quite well with what's said by the theorists of the time. So I urge you to try using different colors associated with the modes and see if they help you in how you play those pieces. Now, because I've got a minute or two left, I'm going to show you one other thing which also serves as a different kind of map. When we began our journey through 20th and 21st century music using the keyboard, one of the things that we were most likely to learn to do was scales. And even if you didn't play a keyboard, you were probably taught to do scales in every key. So our assumption is that learning scales is the basis of learning every instrument. But if we go back and look at the actual books that were used in the 16th century to teach instruments, we find that scales are not mentioned. In fact, the word scale has a different meaning in those 16th century books. Here is the word scale at the beginning of a drawing from the 1551 book on the art of music by Georg Rau. But what he is using that word to mean is its Latin meaning of a ladder. This is the ladder of the notes going upwards and the notes going downwards, and how we are to say the syllables for them. And on the next page of the book, he shows you the ladder of how to do that when there's a B flat at the beginning of the music. That's the idea of a scale as a ladder. Now, what was used for actually practicing is something more like this. What we have here is not 8-note scales or 16 notes, 15-note scales. These are fragments of the hexachord, of the voces musicales. So, for example, we have something like this, where we see ut, re, mi, ut, mi. We practice the interval by practicing what's within it. Ut, re, mi, fa, ut, fa. Ut, re, mi, fa, sol, ut, sol. Ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ut, la. And the same going down. In fact, if any of you have ever played that marvelous Zenful Fortuna ad voces musicales, you have actually sung that line, because one of the lines is this pattern of dividing up each interval with the notes inside it and then singing the interval. So instead of scales, practicing intervals and what's inside them was primary to playing an instrument. even as late as Christopher Simpson, when he mentions a scale and shows one in his book, he talks about the scale of music. He's not talking about scales. He's talking about the ladder that goes up and down. And he's showing you how to play every single note on that ladder on the bass viol. But he's not saying, now do that in every key. The point of his ladder is to show you the fingering for every note on the instrument. And I thought I would end with an example which is just a lovely way of pulling this together. This is a gorgeous motet by Kraki, Vidit Jacob Skalam. Jacob saw the ladder, from the biblical story of Jacob seeing the ladder going up to heaven and angels going up and down on it. And as you can see, the ladder is spelled out in the part. The ladder goes up, the ladder goes down, ladder goes up, the ladder goes down. So anybody reading from this book would have actually had that same kind of clear identification with the feeling of practicing their ladder fragments when they were learning to read music at the start. So relating the idea of Jacob's ladder with the ladder of music. So at this point, I've come to the end of my musings on how these very different kinds of maps can lead us to see the geography of 16th century music differently from how we might see it by using our modern GPS systems. And at this point, I would love to hear if anybody has questions about it or further discussion.
Great. Hey, thank you so much. Everybody, you can show your video again and do the jazz hands because that's the Zoom way of clapping where I come from. And I want to thank you very much, Sarah. So consonant with what I'm thinking about and doing nowadays. I don't think of my notes on my instrument as anything other than solmization syllables now. And it wouldn't help me if I did. But I'm going to ask you a question from the chat. Charlie would like to know, and this is great question. Are viols different from the modern day violin, alto, and cello?
Yes, they are, and that's a very good question. And there are various ways that they are, but the main thing that we can talk about right now is that the viola da gamba family was separate from the violin family. In the 16th century, the violin family had a very different function in the world, and violins were generally played only by paid musicians and not necessarily ones who could read music. Whereas the viola da gamba was played by educated musicians and amateurs. The main difference as far as the fingerboard goes is that the viols had frets. They always had frets. They're not there for training purposes. They're part of the sound that the instrument makes. And the strings are tuned a fourth apart with a third in the middle as opposed to a fifth apart as the braccio or arm strings are. I hope that helps to answer the question.
And that other part of that was, are they more resonant? I think of violins as being more bright, but...
Yeah, there are two different concepts there. Resonance, there's resonance, there's color, and there's also loudness. The violin family is louder because they're under a greater amount of tension. Certainly modern violins are a great deal louder because of the kind of strings and setup that they have. But the viola da gamba is probably, you might say, more resonant because it has more strings that are actually working sympathetically with the ones that are being played.
Great answer. I have a question from Susan Weiss. I see Professor Susan Weiss is there.
Sarah, thank you for this wonderful talk. And I've just figured out something about why the hands convert from spiral and then to the ladder format in the 16th century. And I've published about this, but I don't know whether you've seen any of that stuff. Some of the hands in the 16th century how-to books or the primers have the gamut going from, gamma, ut, re, be, and going up and down this way.
Oh, really?
Right. And then, Ramos played around with a different hand. And my theory is that the Catholics kept the hand and the Protestants got rid of it and used the ladders or circles. And one of the things I've been studying, which is really tying in with what you're talking about, the kinesthetic and the synesthesia, are these volvels that actually require you to turn them in order to see the hexachords.
Oh,
and
marvelous.
The earliest one is, Adam knows this, in Wilfling Seder's Erotomata of 1563, printed in Nuremberg, where they were very interested in navigational tools. And Daniel and I are part of an IMS study group on the art of the diagram. So this is really tying in very well with the move from the vocal conceptualization to instrumental music, which became so important. And the other thing I was going to say is that there are these early diagrams in Duran, and Daniel can talk about them, and also in Amat, the guitar treatise, that have the majors on the major scales on the top and the minor scales on the bottom. So scales are beginning to kind of have that modern concept that you're talking about.
And when is that, Susan?
Well, Amat, there's a Newberry Library copy of 1596, and the Duran is late 15th century. With 15th. It has all of the conjunctus, all the forbidden hexachords are in that one. Yeah.
Wow, cool.
Yeah.
You guys know what I'm thinking. Sounds like another EMSI Musicology Forum talk coming up soon. Like a whole other can of worms there. I have another question for you from Lynn Snyder. Can you say, and I had the same question, what's the source for the book that showed practicing the intervals by practicing the ladder in between the intervals, yada-dam, ba-dam, ud, re, mi, fa, ud, fa?
That's a Ganassi page, actually.
The nice thing is that also you can find the same pattern in Floris Musicae Omnis Cantis Gregoriani from like 1488 print. If you look up Flores Musices, you'll find it as well. So Ganassi, is that Ganassi Regular Albertino?
Yes. Yeah,
right.
It's the viol book. Yeah.
Great. I've got other questions. I know I do. If you're not seeing me see your hand, feel free to unmute and say, I have a question. I will just say that I think of my shawms a fifth apart, but I think of my fingering patterns as fourths. Ud, re, mi, fa, ud, re, mi, fa. So very similar to thinking in the gamba on my shawm. I have a question from our PhD musicology student and famous gamba player, Eric Tinkerhess.
Hi, thank you for such a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Eric.
I really liked how you explained how on the recorder and the viola da gamba, the notes have different sounds based on where they are on the instrument, and they're not all very well rounded like a modern keyboard instrument. I was wondering how your findings about the tuning of these modal instruments and modal music might affect how we tune open strings on a viola da gamba.
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think what we come back to is the description that Ganassi gives us of the distance between the strings in terms of species of fourths. That if we can tune perfect whole tones and the right size of semitone, then we're going to get the distance between the strings necessary to make it work. But I will tell you a story about it, which is that behind Mac, and Mac right now appears to be a picture of a Landsknecht, but behind him you can see on the wall part of my set of Renaissance viols. And this this set, we have 6, and my ensemble went away on retreat about 4 years ago to really get to know these instruments and the music that we're going to play on them. And we spent the first day and a half only tuning. Aren't you glad you weren't there? In any case, it was actually splendid and wonderful, and we just tried to work out a tuning system that would not involve any kind of electronic tuner, where we would listen and really work on the appropriate distances and intervals. And once we had worked it out and moved our frets around a great deal, we then checked it against an electronic tuner. And to our surprise, it came out as what the little one on my phone calls almost equal, which was not what we expected. We'd been shoving our frets around for a day and a half, but we were making the adjustments that we needed with our fingers and with pulling and pushing, because we were having to deal with the problems of mis and fas. Now, we did have the mis and fas, the fas moved away from the mis a little bit, but it turned out that our open strings were coming out as what it calls almost equal.
Thank you.
Other questions from somebody?
I think we had one in the chat from Maria.
Maria is asking, Rochelle, can you read that to me while I'm looking for it?
She's asking, does this geography apply in the same way to the violin as well?
I sure hope it does. But so much of that has to be done. That has to be done with the ear, since there are no holes or frets to go for. And that's an interesting question to ask the 16th century violin players as they moved from being players who played mostly by ear to being players who also played other instruments where they read, whether their tuning system changed over time or not. The one thing that you can say is that violinists absolutely would not be in tune with a modern piano. That would not have occurred to anyone to play equal half steps throughout.
And yes, and we have a question, would this work on the lute too? And I'm sure you can answer that probably in the affirmative, and Jason Yoshida just gave a paper on solmization of lutes too. So
absolutely. Lute and viol are the same thing, with the sound produced differently. The main difference is that lute frets aren't splittable. And so lutenists who want to have an alternative place to play certain notes in order to get their mis in tune actually would tend to glue a special small piece of fret in place where they need it. It's also a little bit easier to bend the pitch on lute than it is on viol because of the lower tension.
Great. And I'll just add in there that for me, this works on shawms because on the natural fingerings, I don't mean the weird ficta fingerings, the weird cross ones that you have to work on, but all of the mis on the shawm are flat and all of the fas are high naturally. So they actually fit into the solmization fits into the same thing you're talking about on the wind instrument and on the recorder for that matter.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. This is Jason. That was a great presentation. I was going to say also regarding like bending the strings for Bermudo in his treatise also recommends one of the possibilities of adjusting for the temperament or the mi and the fa by bending. So that was and also choosing different strings. But yeah, he says that for the viola.
And the choosing of different strings is an interesting question as well. As viol players would recognize, the choice between an open string and a closed string we make for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons can be function within the hex chord in order to make something stronger or weaker within the hexachord. One of the things that I will say to viol players is to think about how it feels to go from an extended finger F to an open E. That motion from that very extended, slightly covered sounding first finger note to the brightness of the open E, that fa to mi, is a distinctive sound that we sometimes try to avoid because I think partly because of modern training. Those of us who played modern instruments were taught to try to make every note sound the same. And our instruments of the 16th century are telling us they're not all the same. And they deserve to be sort of cherished for the differences among them.
Excellent. Do I have other questions?
I was going to say one
Adams.
thing too. This is Jason. I'm glad that you brought up the alto viol, because for lute, I'm sure you've probably read and looked at that in the 15th century and early 16th century, the lute in A, or is really the most common instrument being played, and a real common duo or musical ensemble was a tenorista and a discant player would usually play a viola or lute in La or A, and then the tenorista would be in a G instrument, maybe something like a viol or another lute. So it's really fascinating.
I'll say on an aside, you might be interested to hear about a couple of instruments that are going to be showing up at our house any minute. We're waiting for the UPS. Mac has a viola da mano coming, and the builder of that instrument happened to say, I built a viol that matches it, and I hear that your spouse plays viol, and I wonder if you'd like to try it. So they're coming together, and that's exactly the combo that we're planning to put together with those. So.
You'll have to get a room, guys. Get a room.
Hey, he's downstairs. I'm upstairs.
So, and we have a question for you from Adam Bregman, who I just have to tell everybody, Adam Bregman is ABD, which means he's working on his dissertation now and nothing else.
And yet he's asking a question.
If you say so. Hi, Sarah. Thanks for that. That was really great. Following up on this last series of questions, basically, I wanted to know what you make of Anne Smith's work on, playing with mis and fas, and what I mean by that is, I agree with what you said. I think the way that you think. I think where the kind of the way the notes sound is inherent to the note and the instruments. They just kind of do it on their own. Whereas Anne tends to think that you make the notes do one thing or another. So fas, you really are weak, and mis are kind of hard. So I wanted to ask what you thought about that.
I was waiting for somebody to ask about that, actually, because it confused me a lot when that book first came out, partly because I'm often trying to get people to make less sound on their mis in final chords, because they can tend to dominate in the spelling of a final chord. And I think that there are two different things going on there. There's the quality of brightness and harshness that goes with the fingerings of mis, and a quality of coveredness that goes with the fingerings of fas. But although she does mention instances of actually trying to make more of that with singing, I think that that's going off on a tangent which doesn't help the music. I think that when it comes to be a me in a context of a sonority, that you need to be thinking about that sonority and the balance of that sonority, and not letting the third dominate the root in that sonority. And I think I do think it's the quality and character of the sound of the instrument, rather than trying to bring it out separately.
Right. Yeah. Do you think it might also have to do something with the difference between Pythagorean tuning versus mean tone temperament, and that shift that's happening? So in the way that treatises through the middle of the 16th century talk in terms of the tuning system Pythagorean, as opposed to writing about the difference of intervals in terms of this mean tone temperament that we assume and that we know has been used for a number of years already.
I think it is an example of the theory lagging, as it often does, and just not being able to let go of these old thoughts, where me used to be basically dissonant because it was so high and so brash.
Right.
And theorists having a hard time letting go of that. But I don't think that the practicing musicians were doing that.
Great, thank you. And I
Thanks.
have a question from Kenneth Bay, who has taken his brush away from his work on the canvas to ask you what you just said about playing from F to E open string. Then what about when you choose to play them on the next string down as closed fingered notes? How do you reconcile what's easier in a higher fingered position with the same interval that uses the open string for one of the notes?
I think it's contextual. I would, for example, in a Phrygian piece, never play the E closed. I want the E to be the core, the basis of what everything is tuning to, because the mi fifth of Phrygian is the basis of everything that is Phrygian. So if I'm moving from F to E in a tenorizans cadence in Phrygian mode, I want that closed F to go to an open E for sure. So I'll feel the tragic softness opening up into the hardness of that E. Whereas an F-E-F in a Lydian cadence, I would make sure I played those both closed, because I would want the F to be the predominant one and not let the E come out. Does that make any sense, Ken?
Somebody write that down, the tragic softness closing to the hardness of E. Yes, and yes, Susan White says Bonnie Blackburn has also written on the Mi-Fa issue back to Elias Salomonis in the 13th century. Kenneth Bay says exactly the answer I was seeking. Thank you. I will just say,
you, Ken.
I keep coming back to this, that on the recorder, yes, there are many different cross fingerings, but the one that are with, and this is what strikes me, what you said, the ones that are actually in the official hand. The Mi's are not cross fingerings, and the Fa's are all cross fingerings.
Exactly.
And they are sharper, the Fa's, and the Mi's are a little sit lower in most of the instruments that survive.
And Re and Sol blow really easily.
Yeah.
They're strong, big notes that you have to be really careful with, actually, if you're not going to go out of tune, because they blow so easily.
I'm a shawm player. I'm not careful. Do we have other questions? Other comments, questions? You can unmute yourself if you like to, because I'm going to unmute all, but you're allowed to. Mac Ramsey, what are you doing here?
I can add my 2 cents about trombone. If Adam's
yes.
the modern custom of playing trombone nominally in B flat, with the closed position being B flat, making all the closed positions Fa's basically, seems absurd to me in this context. And playing it in the key of A, as it seems to have been clearly done, is completely compliant with what Sarah says.
And I because he said that, I'm going to show you one more picture, which I saved as additional materials in case anybody brought up the trombone, but I didn't plant Mac. But this picture from Virgiliano, oh God, it's tiny. Can you all see this? This is something that Mac has pointed out to me, that Virgiliano only gives 4 positions for the trombone. And like Ganassi saying, figure out your other notes. He's saying that about the other notes within the outside the hand, and that's a pretty fascinating one too. So instead of thinking of all notes as being as born equal, you have a sense that some are more equal than others.
So appropriate political terminology for nowadays. Adam Bregman, do you want to say that with me you're forced to play an entirely different pitch when you're playing with shawms, or?
Sure, I didn't want to bore people with all that and take it on a long, weird tangent.
Keep it short, Bregman, keep it short.
You're making Mac happy now. Just go ahead and make him happy.
Well, actually, this ties to another question I wanted to ask you, Sarah. So on the Agricola fingering chart, Agricola is the first to give fingerings for all of several families of wind instruments, not just recorders, as Verdung does. So Verdung says these are the recorder fingerings for discant, tenor, and bass, basically. But Agricola then adds for the shawm, the shawmide, so the soprano shawm, and the bombard, the alto shawm, and then crumb horns as well. And for the shawms, he says, well, the discant shawm is in G, plays G fingerings, and the bombard plays C fingerings, which would make him sound a fifth higher than what Praetorius tells us about nearly a century later. So with sackbut playing, then, if you're going to play in that place, that very high place, if you call first position D, then you're at that high place. So it's instead of saying, oh, well, I have to change my clef, I put in a tenor clef there and I add a sharp to play up a fifth. If you just kind of change what you call, where those diatonic positions are that you just showed with the Virgiliano, you just say, oh, well, it's not an A, it's a D, and you move that. You can just kind of move to that place, and it works really nicely. So like playing a bass, but a bass sackbut much later, but an octave higher, essentially, or playing it on a tenor rather. And in the same way, though, we know that because of the finite range of the shawms, and so most of the wind instruments, they need to be able to move to make it possible to play a piece in a given range, or in a different piece in another range. And the same way that transposition can easily happen with the modes, as you were saying, you can be in one place or another, you move it up and down. With the addition of a flat, we can do that on these instruments too. So instead of calling your 7-hole note a G on the shawm, you call it a C, and then you're in a different place. On the sackbut, you can do that too, but instead of being an A, which is, again, that's a later thing, you'd be in G. So in the alto ensemble, it'd be, now we say playing up a step or up a fifth. But really, I think the original places were just G or D for the sackbut, or G and C for the shawm, and C and F for the bombard. So just knowing where you can be.
You've been radicalized by 15th century shawm players.
I have.
And meanwhile, I'm watching Mac's face to see if he's going to refute anything. But nope, he's not. Good.
So then, what I was wondering, Sarah, was you mentioned on the third string from the bottom of the viols. Mm-hmm. Those are your places where ut are. It was C, F, and G.
Yeah.
But moving one string over to the fifth, I know that Agricola gives these 5-string viols for discant and tenor / alto instruments, and then the bass has 6 strings. And I was curious what you think of that, because he's trying to do the same thing, it seems, where the discant instrument is a G instrument, and the tenor instrument's a C instrument as its lowest note, and et cetera.
I have to admit that I carefully chose things that would fit within my worldview.
Yeah.
As we all do. And I for a long time, my worldview didn't include a B string. Now it has. And over time, my worldview may begin to include 5-string viols and ones that have fifths as well as fourths, but I'm not, or don't have a third at all. But I'm not there yet. So I just keep saying, well, after about 1550, they all had 6 and they were tuned this way. So I'll stick with that.
That's fair. Thank you.
Wow, cool. So cool. Are there other questions? We are definitely heading toward the one more question time. If there's somebody who has one more question. Otherwise, one more question. Going. I want to ask you all to unmute your videos, show your videos, and unmute yourself. And I'll give jazz hands and say thank you to Professor Sarah Mead for such a great talk.
Thank you, Pat.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
Lynn, I want to hear more about your work sometime. Send me an email.
Yes,